Today we are talking about your transcendental self. Now, most people today identify with their ego self, their avatar self. And then you have certain Eastern religions like Buddhism that believe in Anatman, or no self. So, do you have a true self? What is your true self? What is your transcendental self? These are all questions that we are going to be answering today in the context of Leibnizian philosophy, Kantian philosophy, certain Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, and of course then we're going to have the overarching perspective of Hyperionism and see where people get things right, where people get things wrong, and how to really understand your true self, your transcendental self that is beyond space and time. So, we're going to be reading excerpts from The Holographic Soul by Mike Hockney, which again is an excellent book. I highly recommend it. If you'd like to read it for yourself, the link to where you can do so will be in the description of this video. Also, we were supposed to continue our reading of the Secret Gospel of John this week. However, we didn't. And the reason why is because you guys know that I was feeling kind of sick the last couple days. Well, in addition to that, today I had scheduled to get my vaccine. So I got my vaccine this morning. And so when I was deciding on what live stream we were going to do, I had no idea how I was going to be feeling today. So I decided to move that one to next week. With, everything, all these different factors, I wanted to make sure, because you guys know that I tend to get a little exuberant when I read Gnostic texts. I wanted to make sure that I was very in the mood and feeling well enough to do so. So we will be continuing that next week, but let's dive into your transcendental self, because I'm feeling great and it's going to be an excellent topic. The transcendental self is the immortal soul. The empirical self is the mortal soul, the space-time consciousness that dies with each body and is replaced each time we reincarnate. So today we're going to talk a lot about the transcendental self and the empirical self. And as always, let's talk in terms of the Hyperion triadic perspective of avatar, monadic, and absolute. Remember, I'm telling you guys, this is key. Understanding these three perspectives is key to understanding Hyperionism. Avatar, monadic, and absolute. So, the transcendental self is the immortal soul. That is the monadic perspective. That is the monadic self. You as a monad. The empirical self is you as an avatar. Your body and your ego consciousness that goes with that. Now, the vast majority of humanity today is simply trapped within the avatar perspective. They have no understanding of the monadic or the absolute perspective. They are trapped within their empirical ego self and not within and don't understand their transcendental self. Now, as always, I want to emphasize that Hyperionism does not condemn the ego. Like many New Age systems and many Eastern religions, the ego is not a bad thing that we need to destroy. It is a powerful tool that we need to embrace, but that does not mean that we need to identify with it. So we can embrace something, but not identify with it. Just like we can embrace a powerful tool, like a hammer or a computer, but we're not identifying with it. We're not saying, I am the hammer or I am the computer, but it is a powerful tool. We don't want to destroy it, like many New Age systems, etc., say that you should do. So the ego, as we're going to see, is actually a function or a concept that the transcendental self develops, or a function that the monadic self develops. Your ego self and your avatar, your body, is what allows your monadic self, which is your transcendental self, to access the material realm of the holos. It's its vehicle, it's its gateway. Kind of like how, let's say, a computer code generates a game character to be able to place itself within the game world that it has constructed. So, the space-time, the empirical self is the mortal soul, the space-time consciousness that dies with each body and is replaced each time we reincarnate. So your avatar, your avataric body, your avatara will die, as well as your ego, specific ego self. That is also a concept that is contingent and will go away. Your necessary and eternal self, your monadic self, will then link to a new avatar, a new avatara, and develop a new contingent conceptual ego as the tool to which it will use to function in the material world, the holos. Human beings have a profound problem given that they invariably identify with their empirical self, their avataric self, even though this is doomed to die, but have little or no relationship with their transcendental self, which never dies. So most humans identify with their avatar self, and they have no idea that their monadic self even exists. The ego might be thought of as the part of the soul that is brought into space and time awareness with each new incarnation. When the body dies, so does the space-time ego linked to it. So when your avatar body passes away, so does the specific ego consciousness that you have developed during that lifetime, because that is a contingent concept. The ego is just a concept, a function that your transcendental self, your monadic self, developed. So when the body, avatar, dies, so does the space-time ego linked to it. But the transcendental self, your monadic self, is of course outside space and time, and hence cannot perish. Your monadic self is the self that exists outside space and time, in the source singularity, is equivalent to zero, and is hence mathematically necessary, indestructible, and immortal. The transcendental self, the monadic self, reflects the accumulation of the experiences of all the egos. So you can sort of imagine that your monadic self exists in the source singularity, and it develops these specific avatars and conceptual ego configurations, links to avatars, and develops conceptual ego configurations to explore the space-time holos, and it's gathering data. And through that, your various avatars and ego selves might pass away. But, by the way, when I refer to avatar, I refer to the combination of everything that's related to space and time. So when I refer to the avataric self, the avatara, I am referring to both the body and the ego consciousness. So, when the avatar passes away as that body and ego consciousness, your mind is still, your mind as the eternal mind, as the monadic self is returning, your transcendental self is still collecting that information and that data. So what I mean by that is, imagine that you are playing a video game and your character dies, and so then you start a new character and play the game for a while. Then that character dies, and then you start a new game and start a new character. Well, each character dies and passes away, but you as the transcendental player that is outside of the game Well, you're retaining all the information that each one of those characters gathered. So even though each character passes away, and for that character it's their end, you as the player outside of the game that links to that character is retaining that information, and you're the accumulation of the data of all those characters. So likewise, your avataric selves that have existed throughout space and time in this chain of incarnations might fade away, pass away, die and come back, die and come back, die and come back as different avatars. But you as the monadic self outside in space and time are the accumulation of all that data gathered. They are, in Hegelian terms, each one of your egoic avatar selves are essential moments of your monadic self. And this is what contributes to the development, unfoldment, evolution, and actualization of your true self. Because you're gathering more data, you're evolving, and you're growing. This is why in Hyperionism, reincarnation has nothing to do with morality, it has nothing to do with karma, it has nothing to do with the creator God. It is a mathematical process about evolution, growth, and actualization. The purpose of incarnating is not to learn some moral lesson or please some god. It's a function developed by your monadic self to gather data for its evolution and growth. They are essential moments in your monadic unfoldment, which is ultimately apotheosis, godhood. So the transcendental self, your monadic self, reflects the accumulation of the experiences of all the egos. Kantian transcendental selves are just Leibnizian monads. The universe is made of unconscious transcendental selves, which become conscious in space and time via empirical selves, egos. Gnosis, enlightenment, occurs when the transcendental self itself becomes conscious, fully objectively consciousness. This is God consciousness. So, what are Leibnizian monads? Essentially, the philosopher Leibniz posited that reality is not physical, but composed of what you might call mental atoms that he called monads, so which are minds. So Leibniz said that reality isn't physical, it is a composite of minds. It is composed of minds that he called monads. Now in Hyperionism, we have a similar position. We still use the word monad, but it's a little bit different. Reality is in fact composed of monads, but it's composed of the frequency components of those monads interacting. So for Leibniz, the physical world was literally made out of monads, out of minds. In Hyperionism, monads, minds exist, but the material world isn't made of monads, but made of the frequency contents of monads. The thoughts, the monadic thoughts interacting and combining together. So the universe is made of monads, their thoughts interacting and giving rise to the space-time holos. And this is facilitated by a Fourier transform. It has to do with signal processing, frequency, space-time, but we won't get into that too heavy today. Check out my other videos if you're interested in that information. But in other words, anyway, in a nutshell, reality is composed of the frequency contents of minds, monads, each and every one of us interacting together. And these monadic minds, which is what you are a monadic mind, you are a soul outside of space and time. These monadic minds become conscious by linking to avatars and developing the concept of the ego. So you see, the ego is an important tool. We do not want to destroy it, like many Eastern religions and many mystical systems and many New Age systems say. We don't want to destroy it. That's what allows us to develop consciousness. But we don't want to identify with it. You don't want to say, I am my ego. No, your ego is something you developed. It's a conceptual tool allowing you to explore the world. And so you as a monadic mind outside space and time develop these avatars, develop these egos to explore the holos. And this is how you become conscious. And when you become fully conscious, this is God consciousness. This is apotheosis. This is you becoming and actualizing your monadic self. Now, I want to throw in here, let's read a little bit more first before I get into this. But we're gonna so the whole of Kant's noumenal domain that so beguiled philosophers was never anything other than Leibniz's universe of monads. Leibniz gave the answer a century before Kant, yet no one realized it. Leibniz is still opaque to the academic world of philosophy, math, and science. All of the phenomenal objects of Kant's philosophy, grounded in noumenal objects outside space and time, were actually just the mathematical products of mathematical monadic souls and their mathematical relations. Now, this gets a little complex because it depends how you define noumena and phenomena, and that is a bit of an advanced topic. So I'm not going to get into that too much today. However, in terms and the context of how it is currently being discussed in this book, for those who are familiar with Kantian philosophy, Kant posited that there was a noumenal domain that we cannot know. Well, we actually can know it. It's simply the source singularity, the domain of pure mind. Now, just as a caveat here, though, I want to, if this goes over anyone's heads, just ignore it. Don't worry about it. However, there is a discrepancy. Sometimes noumena is described as the frequency domain, and phenomena is described as the space-time domain. Other times, noumena is described as mathematical form, and phenomena is described as mathematical content. And these are all different concepts. The frequency domain is not the domain of form. It gets see. Now we're mixing reality tunnels because we're not talking about Plato's domain of forms. This is why we all need to get on the same page, and why definitions need to be clearly demarcated and defined. Because, for example, if I talk about form, oh my God, well, are you talking about the Platonic domain of forms, or are you talking about form and content? It gets very, very muddied. So, basically, just what I want to say, if you read my books, when I talk about noumena and phenomena, I am talking about mathematical form versus mathematical content. And this is more, in my opinion, how it should be defined, because what noumena is the thing in itself, outside of any kind of experience of it. And we can experience the frequency domain, but we can never experience form. But we can know form via reason. And just to let me just finish this real quick, because I'm getting sidetracked here, and I don't want to get off on this tangent for too long. But the difference between form and content is, imagine a rainbow. Well, a rainbow is just the visible light spectrum. And so you could have a mathematical equation for that rainbow, for those frequencies. Now there's a difference between that equation and the experience of the color. The equation is the mathematical form, the structure, and the color is the content. We can never experience the structure itself, but we can know it via reason. The content we can experience. It's the color that we experience, and it's different for each of us depending on if perhaps we're colorblind or we're a fly or a human. We're all going to experience that differently. So the frequency domain can be experienced. The holos can be experienced. Mathematical form cannot be experienced, It can only be accessed via reason. So this is why I define noumena as being the domain of mathematical form, because it is the domain of structure that can't be experienced. It's the in itself, truly, in itself, the thing that is outside of experience. But anyway, I just want to say that that is something that we're going to need to clearly define at some point, because there's a little bit of a discrepancy between how those words are used, and that's why we all need to get on the same page and define our terms. But let's move on from that, because I could do a whole stream on that, and I feel like it's a bit too technical for what we're talking about today. And okay, so just as a recap, because I got a little sidetracked here, we're talking about the transcendental self versus the empirical self, which is the monadic perspective versus the avatar perspective. Same thing. We're just using different words for the exact same thing. The ego self is the avataric self. The avataric self is your space-time body, and the ego self that goes along with that. And your transcendental self is your monadic self, your true self that exists outside space and time. Now, it's also important to understand that there is another level, and that is the absolute self. Because remember, we have the three Hyperion perspectives: the avataric self, the monadic self, and the absolute self. And the absolute self is the perspective of all of us taken together as one. That is the one mind, the absolute mind, abraxas. This is us from the perspective as one being, where from that perspective, I am me, I am you, and you are me. But that is a very specific perspective, and we need to be able to use and understand rationally every single one of these perspectives. Because just like the monadic self uses your avataric self to experience space and time and the holos, the absolute self uses monadic selves to experience multiplicity and particularity. So you see this unfoldment and these different levels. You have the absolute self, the one, that others itself into particular monads to experience particularity, and these monads then link to avataric selves to experience individuality. So we have unity, universality that generates particularity, that generates individuality. And you can see how it's these emanations. And for those of us who are following, by the way, our stream on Gnosticism on that we're reading, start to connect the dots and see how this all relates to what we're reading in the Secret Gospel of John as well. So it's vital to understand that the space-time world of matter, the holos, what we exist in today, the waking world, the so-called waking world, is a holographic product of the monadic collective. That is the collection of all monads. The one, the absolute. So when you go to sleep and dream, that is a dream world generated by your monadic self. This waking world is the dream of the collective, the dream of the one, the dream of the absolute, which is just the collection of all monads. Individual monads are linked to individual bodies within space-time. So this is a bit just like what we were talking about. You see how you have the absolute that through its monadic constituents generates the holos, and then those monadic constituents then link to avatars within space and time in order to explore that dream world that was generated. So individual monads, remember we talked about individual monads, are linked to individual bodies within space and time, and each such body has an extremely restricted space-time perspective in comparison with the whole universe. We can detect with our senses only our immediate local environment. This physical world is a localized universe, in that our field of perception is extremely narrow and tiny. Compared to the universe, we are experiencing a tiny sliver. First of all, we can only experience a tiny portion of the, electromagnetic spectrum. There are frequencies all around us that we cannot detect. Radio waves, microwaves, X-rays, ultraviolet rays, all these different rays that we cannot detect. But not only that, we are localized, meaning we're only experiencing what is in our immediate environment. But do you see how each one of us is a viewpoint in a window for a different monadic mind? And you see, this is how the absolute, the one, experiences multiplicity. We are all individual viewpoints, individual perspectives of the absolute. We can detect with our senses only our immediate local environment. This narrow space-time field is the one presented to our empirical self, our conscious. So the narrow space-time field is what is presented to our avataric self. You, in your avataric self, your ego consciousness, you're experiencing your local surrounding, your local environment. However, our unconscious, which is now the realm of the monadic self, the transcendental self, needs to know what the empirical self is experiencing. Therefore, the empirical self must, via Fourier transforms, convert its local space-time functions, small windows of the overall cosmic space-time function, into frequency functions and pass back that information through this transcendental self. So, you are experiencing local space-time functions that you are converting into frequency functions, and basically you're communicating that back to your monadic self. So via the Fourier transform, you can convert frequency information into space-time information, and space-time information into frequency information, back and forth. This is the difference between mind and matter. And think about it a bit like the difference between a video game code and a video game world. You can either look at the code or you can look at the world. Well, with mind and matter and the Fourier transforms, you can either look at the frequency functions or you can look at the space-time functions. So your monadic self exists in the source singularity of frequency. And so it uses your avataric self, your ego self, as a window to gather space-time data and transfer it back to itself. And then it can make decisions. Because when you make a decision, that is coming from your monadic self. That is coming from your true self. The monadic self is the executive function. And essentially what's going on here is, if you imagine, okay. So let me say, when I say that, it's a lot more complicated than that. So let me put that disclaimer. When I say that, because then we have to start talking about self-awareness and the unconscious versus consciousness and how they communicate back and forth. So let me just put a disclaimer that I just simplified things a lot, so it's a lot more complicated than that. But we'll save that for another time. I just want to put that out there. Now, for a simple analogy, imagine that it's like, again, like you're playing a video game. You have to be able to see what your game character is doing. If you're not seeing what your game character is doing, well, you're not really getting any information. So being able to generate that game character, you're now able to interact in the game world. Same thing with your egoic self, your avataric self. And this is all facilitated via a Fourier transform, which converts space-time information into frequency information and vice versa. So the empirical self, your avataric self, has a space-time view of its local environment. Your avataric self has this space-time view of what's going on. While the transcendent self, the transcendental self, your monadic self, has a frequency view, which it can link to all of the other frequency information it possesses, covering the entire universe. This information not being available to the empirical self. So think of it a bit like your avataric self has access to what's going on in the game world, and your frequency self is immersed in the realm of the code. It's not exactly like that, but it's a good way to understand it. It's a non-local environment versus a local environment. And anyone who is familiar with Fourier transforms will know that the frequency domain is a non-local domain, whereas the space or time domain is a localized domain. The empirical self, your avataric self, is a reducing valve system connected to the local environment. The transcendent self, or the monadic self, is mind at large, connected to the entire universe. So again, if you're in that game world, your avataric self is just seeing pieces of the game. You don't see, when you're playing the video game, you don't see the whole game at once. You just see parts of it where your character is currently located and experiencing. But the code has a connection to everything. And we've talked about this a lot before. You know, the great analogy is the airplane analogy versus someone down on the ground. You know, if you're in an airplane, you can sort of see everything at once, but you're going to miss a lot of details. If you're down on the ground, you can see a ton of details, but you don't know you can't see the big picture. So you want to have both. You want to, you know, sort of imagine that they both have cell phones or walkie-talkies or something and communicate back and forth with each other to help each other out. That's what is all about when we talk about establishing a connection between your avataric self and your monadic self. And this goes with synchronizing your left and right hemispheric functions of the brain, because the left is a conscious function and right is a unconscious function. And so basically we have to utilize that as a way to actualize our full potential. Remember, the ego is super powerful as a tool. We never want to destroy the ego. Again, all those New Age systems, all those Eastern religions that say to destroy the ego, that is the worst thing that you could possibly do. You never want to destroy the ego. But you don't want to identify with the ego either. The ego is an extremely powerful conceptual tool developed by your mind. And you can temporarily bypass it for experiences. And there's nothing wrong with temporarily bypassing it either. But you never want to destroy it. Just don't identify with it. So ontological mathematics plays out over 4 distinct zones. Space-time. This is the domain of space-time functions interacting with space-time functions. It's a collective domain perceived by individual bodies. This is like the game world. It's the holos. It's the Fourier domain of space-time functions. Then you have the frequency zone. This is the domain of frequency functions interacting with other frequency functions. This can involve collective frequency functions, meaning minds interacting with each other, involving several or all monads, individual frequency functions involving individual monads, and collective and individual frequency functions, many or all monads interacting with individual monads. So essentially, that domain is minds interacting with their own frequency functions, or the frequency functions of the collective, or others, minds interacting with mind. Then you have a third zone, the space-time frequency interface. This is the domain where space-time functions are translated into frequency functions via the Fourier transforms form. It allows matter to interact with mind. It's the domain where the senses, our human lenses, translate information about the local physical universe into frequency data for the transcendental self. So this is where, again, you're in your avatar perspective, having a space-time experience, and then you are transforming that information into frequency data, mental data for your monadic self. And then the fourth domain is the frequency space-time interface. Collectively, this is the domain where frequency functions are translated into space-time functions via the inverse Fourier transform. The space-time functions are then detected as space-time objects by the senses. Individually, it's how our private dream worlds are constructed. This domain allows mind to interact with matter. It's the domain of will. It's how mental choices are translated into physical actions in the material world. So the main thing to take away from this is, as it says right here, the universe is not mechanistic. It's not like a clockwork machine. There is a rich mental world that is responsible for all that occurs. And thinking that the world was some kind of mechanical machine was the fundamental error of classical physics. Only the space-time zone, only one of these zones that we just discussed, has the appearance of mechanism. But the frequency domain is that of will and teleology. The other two domains are those defined by transforms. This is a mathematical, not a scientific, religious, or philosophical universe. Until you grasp that, you will never understand reality. All right, let me actually answer this question by P-Wing, which is a really good idea here. So P-Wing says, hey Morgue, this reminds me somewhat to the idea of Bishop Berkeley's idea that we are all in the mind of God, or the Vedic concept that we are a product of a dream. It's amazing how it all correlates together like a constantly evolving superorganism. Well, very interesting that you should say that, and good insights. First of all, we are a constantly evolving superorganism. And it's important to understand that, so Bishop Berkeley, you're absolutely right. He had the idea that reality is the dream of God, and that we are all ideas in the mind of God. Now, this is sort of the classical idealist view of existence. Now, I want to emphasize that Hyperionism is an idealism, but it's a very specific kind of idealism. It's a hyper-rational, mathematical idealism. And so the difference between, what we talk about and Bishop Berkeley is that for Bishop Berkeley, we're all ideas in the mind of God. Now, for us, it's important to understand that we are God. We are the absolute that is particularized through particular monads. And so it's just important to realize that we ourselves are God, and we are nodes of God. And that's why it's important to have all three perspectives of the avatar, monadic, and absolute. And so understanding this, it's not like we all are, again, it's very similar to a neural network. In a neural network, there are the nodes, the neurons of the overall network. And in Hyperionism, we are both the network and the nodes at the same time. We are the nodes and the network. So there is a big difference between Bishop Berkeley's ideas and Hyperionism, and I'm sure that you know that. But I just wanted to mention that in case, you know, some people may be familiar with philosophical idealism, and I want to make that clear for those who may be. But let's continue. P-Wing says, the avatar could also be the mask we wear in society. Now, the thing to understand about this, and I'm glad that you brought this up, is that the mask that we wear in society is actually known as the persona. And so we're going to get into this a little more here. So just like your ego and avataric self allows your monadic self to navigate the holos, the physical world, your persona is what allows your egoic self to navigate society. Because the persona is the mask that you wear to be able to get along in society. When someone, you know, comes up to you and says, hey, how you doing? And you respond with, oh, I'm doing great. How are you? Even though you may be doing absolutely terrible, the persona is the one that responds with, oh, I'm great. How are you? It's the mask, the false version of you that you wear that allows you to navigate society. So the persona is kind of like the mask of the ego, and the ego is like the mask of the monadic self. So you have all these selves within selves within selves within selves. All these different functions that are developed for navigation. So your monad links to an avatar and develops the ego in order to navigate the physical world. And then you develop the persona to navigate society, social institutions, school, clubs you may join, work you have to go to, all these different things is when you wear the persona. So, great. I'm really glad you brought that up. And so we must remember that we're always trying to get to our true selves. And our persona is not our true self. And our ego is not our true self. Our avatar is not our true self. What is our true self? Well, we get into the realm of the true self when we talk about the monadic self and the absolute self. Your monadic self is your particular true self, your eternal monadic soul, what you truly are. And then the absolute self is all of us operating together as the one. So the absolute and the monadic selves are the true selves. And you have to have both. All right? If you have absolute without monadic or monadic without absolute, it's going to be difficult. And we'll talk about this in more detail on later, because at a certain point, the monadic and absolute, as we approach the omega point, begin to sort of asymptotically converge in a certain way, which is really interesting, but way too technical for today's topic. So today's just more of an overview. We'll talk more about how the absolute and monadic selves relate later on. But for now, we have to understand that the avataric self, the egoic self, and the persona are not what you truly are. These are all tools that are important, right? Even though the persona sucks to have to wear all the time, it's an important tool. You don't want to go around in society and someone says, oh, how you doing? You'll be like, fuck you, I'm in a bad mood. You want to, because you're not going to be able to go and operate in society if you're like that all the time. The persona is a tool that is useful. Now, it gets out of control when you identify with it. Now, here's the thing. Here's the crazy thing. You know how I said at the beginning of the stream that most people identify with their egoic self? Well, that's not exactly true, because there's a lot of people who actually identify with their persona. Not even, let alone getting to their monadic self. They haven't even gotten to their ego self. They're still identifying with their persona. They've worn a mask for so long that they don't even know their own ego self. They think that they are the persona. They have identified with their persona. So for these people, it would be a big deal to be able to take the mask off and realize, oh my God, there's another self inside, the ego self that I am. But they aren't actually that. They're the monadic self. So most people are so far gone that they've actually identified with their persona, not even with their ego. So we don't want to identify with our persona. We don't want to identify with our ego selves. We want to go deeper and deeper and deeper and find our monadic selves, our monadic self, and our absolute self. And you see, this is very, very different than you see in Hinduism. You have this idea of Atman. And the Atman is the self or the soul, right? Atman means self. It's the self or soul. And the idea is to go deep inside and realize that the Atman is actually Brahman. And in Hinduism, Brahman is sort of like the absolute, the one ultimate reality. So in certain types of Hinduism, there is this correlation of going inside and discovering deeper and deeper and deeper selves, discovering Atman, discovering Brahman, and unpacking that. Now, in Buddhism, they have the concept of anatman, which means no self. So this is where Buddhism is, they deny that there's any true self, and they're all about extinguishing what they think is an illusion of the self. And that's completely wrong. So Hyperionism is more similar to that idea in Hinduism, but remember, we are not Hinduism. We are different. We are a mathematical idealism founded in logic and reason. We don't have karma. We don't have any kind of morality tied to it. It's all about evolution, and it's all a purely logical mathematical process. And our monadic and absolute self is a lot more like a neural network, when we are all nodes in a neural network. And we are nothing like Buddhism. We are the complete opposite of Buddhism, whereas in Buddhism they have the anatman, the no self, where they are trying to reach nirvana. Nirvana means to extinguish. They want to extinguish. They want to be like a candle that is blown out. We do not want to be like a candle that is blown out. We want to be like a brilliant, shining star that illuminates the universe through our collective illumination. So while in Buddhism they're trying to diminish and go away and extinguish, we are trying to actualize and become and illuminate. So we're all about actualizing and becoming God, not extinguishing and going away. And again, I've said this before, it's very ironic because Buddhism is about trying to escape reincarnation, but it will actually keep you locked into the cycle of reincarnation because you aren't making the progress that you need to evolve. Rather, you're trying to extinguish yourself, because the holos is all about evolving and transforming and going forward. So we want to evolve, actualize, and become, not extinguish, minimize, and vanish. And this is what will allow us to have apotheosis as we actualize our monadic selves, and then collectively we will actualize our absolute self. Now, I think what we're going to do actually is probably end this here, and we will be continuing next week. And the reason why I want to end it here is because I am actually feeling a little bit tired, and I want to be able to jump into the comments and hang out with you guys for a bit. So let's end it here. But hopefully you guys, if you want to know more about these, about your, like the persona and the shadow self, the mirror self, and the power self, look up my Inner Star Actualization series. It's very, very important with regard to this. But like I said, this was all really short in a nutshell. We're going to be exploring the absolute, monadic, and avatar selves in a lot of detail later as well. But I hope that you guys are beginning to really understand that we have all these different perspectives, and we need to place them in their proper positions and realize that they all have a place, and we must utilize them properly. And they are powerful tools. Like the persona, that's a tool. We don't want to get rid of it. We want to be able to use it as a tool, but we don't want to identify with it. The ego, it's a powerful tool. We do not want to destroy it, but we don't want to identify with it. And we must reach in deeper and find our monadic self, which is all about our individual optimization and evolution, and then discover the absolute self, the Abraxian self, which is about collective evolution. And why do we need that? Because that's when we start getting to creating a new world, creating new terra. Because if we didn't have an absolute self, who would give a shit? Who cares? But our absolute self, we are all in this together. This is our collective creation. And my evolution is bound up with your evolution. And together we will actualize a divine society where we can finally be free to transform ourselves and transform the world and begin to create higher levels of existence, higher levels of experience, where we can, start to experience each other's worlds. So my friends, let's understand these different selves, because that is key. Let's educate the world about this and start to actualize new terra. I want to give a shout out to all the amazing supporters on Patreon and some of our top supporters: White Rabbit, John, Susan, Jiwan, Rex. You guys are awesome. And some of our other top supporters as well. It means the world to me. Just a quick note, guys, if you want to support on Patreon, it is the best way to support my channel, because there's a lot of censorship on YouTube and on Facebook, a lot of deplatforming too. So Patreon is the best way to support, and you will get access to our weekly secret live streams.